It is my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for the Technology and Data panel, Rachel McLaughlin. Rachel is a FinTech and a RegTech consultant and a KYC specialist at Pegasystems, Inc. Rachel, thank you so much for moderating the AML Thought Leaders panel and bringing all these great insights to us. Please take it from here.
Sure, Sam, thank you. Good morning or afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. And I would echo what Sam said. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rachel, and as she indicated, I'll be serving as your moderator for today. We're almost 3 months into a new decade, and I was reminded today on the US news that we're officially at 12 months into what is my hopefully first and only pandemic. But with that in mind, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the loss of life and the indelible mark this is leaving on all of us in different ways. My closest friends would tell you that I'm a terrible pessimist, yet simultaneously ingenious at finding silver linings at every turn. And so as what's possible continues to unfold before us, the silver lining I see are the tighter connections in forums like this and energy that's being put towards a greater good across the globe, as is reflected in our panelists today, you, the attendees, and the topic. As Sam indicated, and a bit of housekeeping throughout this data and technology panel, we will be taking questions during the time. Periodically, we'll pause to ask those questions. Yet, as it often happens, we're probably not likely to get to every question, so please note that each panelist has graciously agreed to be contacted after today's webinar for any follow-up questions. Before I get to the introductions of our esteemed panelists, I do want to run through the topics we've planned on covering, so those folks attending can start to think about how it might apply to their mandate and what questions you might have. So we're going to look at data sets. Where can they be found? How are they well housed? What might be required? And what sort of institutions of all flavors make these useful? So anything from a bank to someone like a vendor to also law enforcement. Then we're going to look more at the convergence of data and tech. So how is technology being used to access increased volumes of data as the power of computing has gotten a lot cheaper, and we can help identify bad actors? Then we're going to have a conversation around the cultural shift that's been blended in with corporate responsibility and now extended over to risk and compliance. I think the other piece that we added in with some of the legislation that was recently passed here in the US is the beneficial ownership. So I'm going to ask some of our panelists to talk about some of the missteps that can happen when trying to get data and technology to work together. And those beneficial ownership pieces are very important in understanding the bad actors across our landscape. Lastly, we'll wrap with each panelist talking about any changes in trafficking they've seen during as a result of the pandemic and some final thoughts. So let me get started with our introductions. Rob Goldfinger is a retired law enforcement executive, having served with the Rochester, New York Police Department. He has nearly 3 decades of leadership experience in the public and private sectors. He comes with a unique combination of management expertise and operational leadership across business environments. He's held leadership positions within risk management areas at multiple firms over the years and has a proven ability to design both operational and technical approaches to enhance client risk management programs. Robert's background within the compliance, anti-money laundering, combating terrorist financing, and operational risk disciplines allow him to really view overall risk management operations with a very practical risk-based approach. Over in Luxembourg, we have Matt Long, 20 years of experience working with international clients in the financial services sector. This includes leading operational and management roles within compliance and anti-financial crime and change management departments. He has regular engagements with external parties such as financial intelligence units and regulatory authorities. Matt has been appointed a board member and is a regular AFC conference speaker and author. Next, we're going to jump to the south of the US, and we've got Jennifer Mcintyre joining us from Wells Fargo. As a VP in financial crimes automation and digitization, her area of expertise is in crafting more effective and efficient operations through the use of technology and data. She serves on the board of her local ACAMS chapter and is active in putting together events to inform members on trends in the financial crime space. Gary Schiffman is an applied microeconomist and business executive working to combat organized violence, corruption, and coercion. His knowledge is complemented by his global operational experiences, including his services in the U.S. Navy Surface Warfare Officer, as a U.S. Navy Surface Warfare Officer. He currently serves as a national security advisor in the U.S. Senate and is a business leader at a publicly traded corporation. Currently, Dr. Shipman serves as the CEO of Giant Oak and the CEO of Consilient, both of which are machine learning and artificial intelligence companies that are building solutions to support professionals in the field of national security and financial crime. Back over in the EU and a little bit to the south, we have Ingrid Versharan, a seasoned professional in the data strategy space. Her long tenure with Dow Jones globally puts her in a unique position to provide a great deal of context with regards to the evolution of business-to-business data products and their use in mitigating the abuses that lead to money laundering. Her focus on the risk and compliance business space in the last 10 plus years greatly complements the increase in collaboration we're seeing across banking between the two parts of the business. So without much more, let's get to the good parts. So I think to start with, we were going to have Jennifer talk a lot about some of the data sets, where they're housed in organizations like a bank. And with that, I'll kick it over to you, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you. So when we talk about anti-human trafficking efforts, especially in financial institutions, internal and external data sets obviously are important to bring together. So when I think of internal data sets, you've got your customer data, you have your transaction data, country risk, different typologies, and then you bring in your third-party data, risk compliance data, and bringing all of those different data sets together in a meaningful way and talking about housing them. They obviously never land, especially in a large financial institution, and all of the large financial institutions I've worked with over my career. You put together a data lake and you can have all of these different systems, but ultimately there has to be a way to bring in these things together and keep them updated. And I will certainly turn to my other panelists that are at these data companies and have the platforms where these things can be brought together and housed. But it was really a blend of internal and external customer data and activity, and applying what is known about, the markets and what's out in the industry.
So Ingrid, from your experience, what sort of changes have been seen maybe in how these data sets are constructed, and where can our attendees look to find some of that additional information?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I think if you think about how the data collection has evolved, so we started our risk and compliance data 20 years ago, and that meant that all the research was being done manually. And not only was it being done manually, we actually had to go to physical places to open up books and find information in order to get to the right information, which is now completely unbelievable, right? Because nobody's going to the library to look up who is the ambassador to Togo, for example, right? But that's what you had to do back then. Technology has greatly helped us in actually collecting data, more data, and you can do it faster as well. And what I think is interesting, and for those of you who listened to Sam's overview of ATII, she talked about various data sets, right? And I think in this particular use case, more data is actually better. So very often we talk about more data isn't always better. In this use case, it absolutely is. And I'm not necessarily talking about the quantity of data, but really about the different data sets, right? Because the more data you combine, the better insights you can draw. And what I think is interesting, and this goes back to what has evolved, because now so much technology is being used, and I leave it to the technology panelists who can talk much better about it. But as a result of that, you can analyze so much data. So what we do at Dow Jones, we analyze over 1 million news articles every single day in order to identify possible clues to actually identifying either people or companies who might have been involved in human trafficking. We then combine that data with government lists. We also supplement it with data that we get from NGOs, but that in itself is not enough. Jennifer already mentioned that you need the internal data from the financial institution, which is extremely important, but you need other sets of data as well. You need law enforcement data. You need the more data you can get from NGOs, the better, because they very often have access to data that nobody else has access to. And then you actually need access to dark web data as well, which sometimes isn't very pleasant, right? But if you have access to that data as well, combining all of that, that will give you a much better chance to identify possible cases of human trafficking.
So from there, I may pull a slightly different thread. And Matt, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit about, Ingrid said, had made an interesting remark about quantity of data. Now, I know some of the work that you do is very much oriented around a higher quantity of data over quality. Can you talk about some of how that is useful, again, in really understanding the people that are in these institutions and where some of the bad actors can be found?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It's an interesting tenet that sometimes you think quality over quantity is important, but the reality with a lot of the technology, quantity rules. So for the likes of Quantexa, for example, we utilize something called entity resolution network generation to be able to bring as many data points available internally, externally together. Once you've resolved that entity data, you get a whole different view of the interconnectivity between all of the bad actors, how they're behaving, the roles that they play. A lot of the focus we're going to talk about is follow the money. But I think if we take it a step above and talk about everything that goes on around the money movements as well. So we've been doing quite a bit of work to be able to identify things like professional enablers, things like the logistics company that help support the framework that allows humans to be trafficked and moved. And being able to bring all of these different data together with transactions, that's when you get a holistic picture. And I think when we spoke in the prepping session for this particular session, we talked a lot about context, and we talked a lot about creating context to make decisions. And that's really what you come to when you pull the data together. I say we can talk a little bit as the session evolves around big data technologies, AI, et cetera, but absolutely support Jennifer and Ingrid's point around it's not about looking at anything in isolation. Quantity of data gives you so much more.
So Matt, you actually make a good point that a lot of bankers are probably not used to, because when we're talking, even just listening to ourselves right now, I hear false positives and like more data. I hear that's very messy and a different view. And what does that mean? And I think it's important to point out that with machine learning, you can actually manage your false positives that way. So it's really pulling out the different unique, cases and variables that you wouldn't have seen on your own. I think we're also used to rules-based approaches that it's hard to conceptualize what you're talking about, and knowing that it's not just going to blow up a ton of alerts and reviews in someone's face. It's a different type of technology and identification.
100% agree.
Oh, go ahead, Matt.
No, sorry, I was just going to say, and again, open it up to the panel, right? But 100% agree. The fear of false positives when you bring in an automated solution is palpable. And I've been in the industry for 20-something years, working with both rules engines, working as a consumer of the output of that when I worked within financial services. And you're absolutely right. It's terrifying to think the more data you bring in, the more noise that you fear you'll create. But luckily, the way that technology and the way that analytics has evolved, you can absolutely generate meaningful alerts and reduce that. I'll open that up maybe. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to add to that because I think what is important when we talk about more data, and we all agree about that, the quality of that more data is still important as well, right? So you still want to make sure that the data that you bring in is of high quality. And I think if you do that, and if you make it as processable as possible, right? So as structured as possible, that then in turn helps with reducing false positives as well.
100%. It'd be great to get the thoughts from the other panelists, but certainly from the perspective of Quantexa, we always hear, clients will always say, my data quality is poor. We can't do, I'm concerned about data quality, and everybody starts off with that standpoint. The reality is that is probably true, but it doesn't have to be a barrier to be able to build a picture if you look at multiple data sources. So if you look at one piece of data in isolation, absolutely it'll be impacted if the quality is poor. But if you're using something like real entity resolution, brings data in from everywhere else, then you can overcome those kinds of things. Then you start to look for the analytics that indicate the suspicion of human trafficking or in all its different forms. Is that the same, Gary, Robert, for you guys as well?
I was going to ask Gary. I know Gary has a very similar view to you, Matt. And Rob, I want you to weigh in on some of the elements that law enforcement are particularly looking for. But Gary, I know that Giant Oak takes a very, it's appealing to me because I have a liberal arts background, a very holistic approach on not just what does the data tell me, but what are the human behaviors that are also influencing what we're looking for. So if you could pull some of the threads, I've been watching you take notes. I know that you have some thoughts, so I'll get out of your way.
This is great, and I just love this panel. That we've just been such good, meaningful conversations in the preparation for this. I would say that the way I think about data is Jennifer led off. There's internal data and external data, right? You can simplify the world in two types of data. There's the data in your enterprise, and then there's the data outside of your enterprise. I would subdivide the external data into there's curated data. So lists from an NGO, lists from a Dow Jones, lists from a government agency. And then there's the rest of the world of data, which is this internet place, which is big and messy and disorganized and changes every moment of every day. So just sort of in terms of the first section of our discussion, I divide the world that way. There's internal, external data, and there's the cleaned data, and then there's the big unstructured, messy data. I agree completely that more data is better. And the reason we haven't been using more data in the past is because, as Jennifer said, false positives. I have a government, law enforcement, national security background, and it's the same there as it is in the bank, which is, we want to catch more human traffickers and money launderers and drug traffickers, but we only have so many people, and we can't put up with the false positives. And so we want limited, or historically we've wanted limited data and clean data. I think machine learning, as everybody has said so far, allows us now to open the aperture and to look at more data, and even messy data, even unstructured data. And the reason that's important, getting to Rachel's kind of lead in for me, is because we're trying to understand human behavior. And this is the basis of my entire life's work, is thinking about models of human behavior and illicit behavior. So human trafficking, money laundering, those types of behaviors from a behavioral science approach. And the more data I have, the more observations of human behavior I have, and the more observations I have. Think about any science, whether you took chemistry or physics or biology, any type of science, more observations allows you to build better and more refined models. And with better and more refined models, you're increasing effectiveness and efficiency. You are minimizing false positives and increasing true positives, right? So you are using more data to make your work less, to lighten the load, and to be more effective and more efficient. So that's why we want more data, and thinking about, think as broadly about data as you can. And that's the world we're moving into. And this is available to us only now because of machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, so that brings us to an interesting, I think, kind of juncture. To me, data and information are two different things. So what information are you extracting from your data? And Rob, in your experience, since you've spent an awful lot of time with some of these bad actors, What's a good way for, if you think about the continuum of how financial crimes are found, what's a good way for not only the banks, but also the technologists and the vendor or data vendors to kind of come together and provide law enforcement with a quality data set or quality piece of information? So that'd be my first question. And then I'd also like for you to comment on some of the ways that you can partner. I know in my own work, some of the folks I have access to on the law enforcement side, it's very useful in actually being able to speak to the larger problem.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Let me dwell on the partnering point first. And I think before we start talking about partnering externally, we have to think about partnering internally within our financial institutions and removing some of the walls that exist from business unit to business unit, from silo to silo. We've had a lot of discussion this morning and this afternoon, depending upon where you are, pertaining to data. What I would like to suggest and bring up the subject is, how do we action this data? What is the methodology that we within the financial institutions or other corporations, how do we action this? How do we manage it? And how do we conduct investigations, valid, good, productive investigations surrounding this, so that we can best use our assets? One term or terminology that I would like to enter into this discussion, and it has its origins in law enforcement investigation as well as in financial institutions investigation, and that is the utilization of something that is termed solvability factors. So what are solvability factors? Solvability factors are when certain data or evidence is present, it indicates that a follow-up is appropriate and that some sort of work should be done. So this is a management technique to indicate that if you have, in fact, quality validated data, and we know this is a very big challenge in the human trafficking area, and we heard this from Carol, Phil, and Jim in the earlier presentation, is we don't want to always be the dog chasing the bus, right? And never catching it. And when we do catch it, that we don't know what the heck to do with it. So the concept of solvability factors and using solvability factors are, is this what has been identified either through human effort or red flags or analytics or internal discussions? Is it worthy of investigation and follow-up at this time, or are we just wasting our time and assets and people power to come to a good investigative conclusion that leads to good communication with law enforcement or across the different silos within our financial institution? So how do we get to this point of identifying if a solvability factors are actually in place, and is it worthy of following up on? Well, Larry Cameron from ATII has introduced a very nice workflow where he goes from data collection to entity resolution, which Matt has talked about already today, towards a more action validated output type of workflow. And that's actually where you would apply this solvability factor type of management system. Now, if you have a solvability factor has not met the merit level to do a follow-up investigation, that doesn't mean you just ignore it. What you do is you make that into what we term an office investigation, where you place that back into the analytical routing to say, okay, we have identified, as Gary just talked about, some of these behaviors that have taken place. And then you look to see, have these behaviors been embellished by human observation or by the application of analytics? You build the value of those, and then you maybe combine those with some peer grouping to see if there's any peers within the industry or customer groups to see whether it has gained the value now where it is worthy of follow-up investigation. So what, I like to call it the 3 C's: communication, coordination, and cooperation that has to take place internally. And how do we all do this? We do it by what we call tribal wisdom. And I think this is one of a special challenge in terms of human trafficking and vulnerable populations that we haven't got to yet in our financial institutions, and that our technology companies should be driving towards. How can we force organizations to have these gatherings across their silos and teams so there is communication about what have we found? And this goes through the whole environment of financial institutions and other corporations. It's not only the KYC, the risk function, the risk rating, the due diligence teams and the transaction monitoring teams. It also gets into the lines of business and the product. You know, who is applying for our loans, right? What do we have in these other services that are taking place within our financial institution? And I think it may have been Jennifer that spoke to the frontline people. What are they observing in terms of the behaviors of people that are coming in to the brick and mortar, to the retail, in terms of people that can be proliferating and victimizing the victims or the victims themselves as they come into financial institutions? I have a lot more to say about the utilization of solvability factors as a model and how that model can be applied into the modeling that we can put in place as technology companies. But I don't want to take up, I could speak about this for hours, and I don't want to take up all the panel's time.
Well, we're all in good company there. We'll pause because we're coming to the close of the data set questions and the discrete conversation around data. And Sam, do we have any questions that we need to pose at this time?
We do. We've got 4 questions open. One, do you think that using client activity and behaviors can be more indicative with verified source of fund being involved in an investigation, i.e. trafficking victim being forced to apply for government support, but still being required to send funds to the abuser? That's one. And then there are some other ones about red flags, which I will put our resources link. There's one here from Nicole that says, Gary, yes, more accurate models of human behavior can bring about more efficient analysis, but they often have high upfront costs. How can risk professionals work to justify these costs to our financial institutions? That might be a great one for you there, Gary.
Yeah, that's a good segue too. So go ahead.
That's a great question. So I'm a firm believer in metrics and measurement. So we should be measuring everything that we do for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that we are spending our days and lives and wisely and doing, having the positive impact on the world that we think we're having. And second is that we often have to make a business case to the corporate hierarchy and to the boards and things like that. So measurement is critical in all of this. And what I have found in my years of doing this now is that when you actually move from the rules-based to machine learning based systems and you measure inputs and outputs, you can measure your false positives and you can measure your true positives and your false negatives and your true negatives. And when you do that, you can make the case that these are the human traffickers and money launderers that we found that previously we missed. Okay, so you can get exquisite measurement today, and we really, really need to do that. The second question then becomes, if you want to like push back and fight me on that, because I've been like engaged in this for a while now, is then you have to ask the question is, well, does the board care about that? Right? To what extent does the board care about compliance and buying down compliance risk? To what extent do they care about actually finding criminals? Right? And that's a different question. And I think we need to work to quantify that. Like, what's can we assign a dollar amount to reputational risk for a financial institution that that misses certain types of financial crimes, right? So I think there's 2 dimensions to it, just to summarize. I think we absolutely are moving into an era of measuring our performance much better than we ever have. Again, another benefit of the machine learning world is measuring output in terms of effectiveness and efficiency. And when we talk about the AML reform legislation that just passed, we'll get to that a little bit later. And FinCEN in the United States put out an advanced notice of proposed rule about how do you measure effectiveness and efficiency. So this is the momentum is moving us all towards measurement. And I encourage everybody to think about that. The second part is then, now that we have the measurement, we are this much better at identifying human traffickers, human trafficking victims, money laundering associated with human trafficking. Then we have to make the business case. In some organizations, you don't. In some organizations are like, yeah, we'll just put, if you're finding more human traffickers, we're just going to keep funding it. Other organizations, you might have to make the case. I worked on a project 12 years ago that was U.S. Defense Department funded. And this is all public. It was a program called MEMEX, and MEMEX is about domain-specific indexing in search of the internet. And in my company, Giant Oak, we created a technology called Ghost. And Ghost, many of you have heard of Ghost. Ghost really spun out of this DARPA project, and we had to make the case within the U.S. Department of Defense that building a tool to detect global human trafficking networks was in the national security interest of the United States, because it was taxpayer money we were using. I found that it wasn't a hard argument to make. You know, we won the argument, the program got funded, and we worked it for 4 years and spent $100 million of taxpayer money on programs within MEMEX was the name of the program. But our motivating use case for that program was countering human trafficking. And we had to make the case that if you invest in countering human trafficking, it's going to benefit the entire enterprise. So I think that's the second step that we all have to make is, A, we can measure the results, and B, those results mean something to us as humans, to us as just compassionate people, and also to us as employees in a corporate environment.
So I'd like to add something to that thought.
I was going to say, Jennifer, I was going to ask you to speak to maybe what that looks like on the banking side, since you know, we find that uncovering additional risk can be challenging.
Yeah, so as I was preparing for this panel, I actually reached out to many of my former colleagues and talking to people at financial institutions, and even talking to people that work at vendors, like that have vendor solutions, whether it be platforms or data. And one of the approaches and challenges, or maybe it's a little of both, but there is this decision within tech teams to build versus buy a machine learning capability, right? So a lot of places are choosing to hire these data scientists and hire these, you know, analysts and data tech teams that know how to do it. But in a sense, it's, you know, you're making the decision to recreate the wheel if there's these companies that already have the technology and already have the experts. So there's a lot of factors depending on where you're at. You may have the expertise and capabilities already in your institution or in your organization to apply some of these things, maybe at less cost, and they might not be as effective as leveraging a vendor. I've even talked to some people in the vendor space that they're actually vendors of solutions themselves, but they recognize we don't want to recreate the wheel. We'd rather partner with a company that can do this already. And so that's been an approach as well. But I think it's important as you're to reduce cost and evaluate it that way, this build versus buy versus hire, and take that full view.
Yeah, so Ingrid, from your perspective, since you have a long-standing history inside risk and compliance, do you have any observations or general comments you might make about how that spectrum's changed? And as Gary has alluded to, I think we're all on this cultural shift of starting to own the fact that this behavior is bad for all of us, not just the victims.
And I was going to mention that, because I think that is the most interesting shift, right? And I know, Rachel, I think you had it later on your list. But as Gary brought it, as Gary brought it up, I think what is really interesting is that 20 years ago, it was almost always a checkbox exercise, right? So you had to identify possible risk, and you had to do that because otherwise there would be a fine. And that has slowly evolved. And now I think there might still be institutions that consider it to be a checkbox risk. Sometimes it depends on the maturity of the institution. It depends on the maturity of the jurisdiction in which they are operating. It also depends on the size of the institution as well. But overall, it has definitely evolved. And I think it's becoming less of that. And it's actually not only do I want to comply with the law and regulation, I actually do want to ultimately make the world a better place, right? Because that's ultimately what is all about. It's not about the money. It's to make sure that the world becomes a better place. And what I think is interesting, what you are seeing now is that there is so much pressure from outside of the institutions, and whether that is the investors, whether that is the customer directly, to actually hold the institution accountable to that, right? So I'm not going to do business with you, institution, if I believe that it's just a checkboxing exercise. And slowly what we are seeing is that regulation is following on top of that, right? So there's more and more governments who force companies to identify and to publish and to disclose what they are doing when it comes to ESG, of which human trafficking is a piece, which I think is an incredibly encouraging development.
Sure. So Matt, what are your thoughts on that? Since I know you sit in the EU as well, and the US, we have first order principles around our regulators, so we're not in the game of deciding who wins or loses from a regulatory standpoint. And I think too, the EU, since there's such a huge number of regulators, there's such a broad flavor. If you could give some, broad brushstrokes or just any sort of thoughts on that shift and how we can all learn from each other.
Yeah, and I'm fortunate in that the role that I have is global. So I spend a lot of time with companies throughout the globe. But irrespective of where I am, there's two main drivers which I'm seeing. I'm picking up from maybe Ingrid's point on things like ESG. Being a driver to be more responsible has put this on the agenda in a way that I've not seen before. And I think there's a real drive to understand and be accountable through those external factors. And equally, just as a topic and a domain, I don't think there's ever been so much focus on it in terms of things in the news, things being communicated through social media around this. Stories daily pop up in my news feed around the domain, around the topic in all of its formats. And month by month, week by week, sadly, there's another article, an emotional article, something that really impacts you, and it makes you want to do something. And it makes, in a cold, hard way, investors also make decisions based on that as well. So you've got multiple pulls, both emotional and commercial, to do it. Similarly, to be able to look at those pressures in different areas, like supply chain, understanding your supply chain risk, understanding and going deeper into all of your reputational risks as well. So there's multiple areas that's driving this. But at the heart of it is an emotional one, and I think all of these factors lead to conventions like this. And yeah, so I think almost globally, I see the same story. Some is a little more commercial, but irrespective of that, you've got that emotional desire to be better. And I think that's really, really powerful.
I'll open it back up to Gary or Rob. Do you have anything, additional that you'd want to add there?
Sure.
I realize too, we could probably spend the balance of the time talking about this.
Rachel, let me just add about, because this is getting down to really the specifics of what can we do as individuals, what can we do to drive our circles and our extended circles that we're linked to take very, very positive actions pertaining to what is occurring. First, let me make a comment about AI and machine learning. I'm often asked at my role at BAE, and we reach across you know, Australia, North America, the Mideast, and so on and so on. And I always respond that the criminals don't care about borders. They don't know borders. They will act and react and victimize across the globe, especially with you can sit in a cafe in Germany and victimize someone in the Philippines, right? So we as practitioners have to look at it this way. Dealing with machine learning and artificial intelligence, I think one thing that we have to be very cognizant of is not to get ahead of ourselves, that we have to make sure when something is a behavior or a transaction is identified, that we validate that, especially in the area of human trafficking, because the last thing that we want, and we've already talked about false positives, is for something to be identified and for that to get into the flow, if you will, in the AI or in the machine learning analytic, and then grow from something that's invalid from the beginning. You know, in the practice of law or in law enforcement, that's called fruits of the poisonous tree, where you had some bad fruit and you selected that as evidence, and it wasn't good at the core, and then you've built on a rotten core, and you end up with more garbage. And in our world, that means more false positives. So what can we do? What's actionable with those of us who work in financial institutions or work in corporations? And what I suggest is let's start small with what we know we have our hands on and what we can action on. So an example of this would be, if I'm in a financial institution and I'm involved with KYC or due diligence, well, where can I deploy some data? And I'm going to mention the name of a company. It's not my company. They're one of the sponsors of this conference. It's Nomino Data. Nomino Data provides and I'm sure there's other data providers, but they have about 1 million lines of data in terms of people that could be involved with businesses or entities that are involved in human trafficking. And we've heard them: hair salons, nail salons, call services for prostitution, and so on and so on. What can simply be done is to take a list like this and run it against your customer identification file, your CIF file, and say, are any of these names, addresses, telephone numbers, emails, or other people, and I know we're going to talk about beneficial ownership in a moment, are they linked to these people that are account holders? And you run it against your CIF file and you say, oh, wait, here's some gold. Here are some transactions that are linked to an address that is on this list. So I think in terms of taking action as individuals, taking the spirit of what Gary so enthusiastically has demonstrated today with his passion, where we can start there working that way. And then you can be in a financial institution and say, hey, this is what I found. Let's share that, you know, through 314 here in the United States, right? Or with our law enforcement partners, and start building and building and building on that and attacking the core perpetrators of these horrible crimes.
Thanks,
Hey,
Rob.
Robert, if I could pick up on, sorry, could I just pick up on that one? Sorry. And I couldn't agree more with you. And maybe, Gary, you're heading in that direction there, but this whole idea of collaboration and this whole idea of being able to open up, across Europe, you don't have the 314B, but there's a whole variety of similar mechanisms and bank consortia, which are starting to spring up throughout the globe. There's a really interesting one, TMNL in the Netherlands, and all of those kinds of things. JMLSG in the UK, and so on and so on and so on. And this ability to be open is so transformational, irrespective of the crime and the typology we're looking at. And I see that again in the conversations that we're having. The ability and willingness to share and collaborate is changing. Now, I remember speaking at an ACAMS conference in Vegas quite some time ago about public-private partnerships. And one of the panelists, so one of the audience attendees, said they would never share their data. They would never share their IP. They would never share what they had identified as being a good mechanism to identify suspicious activity, because to them it was a competitive advantage. Now, that world is thankfully changing, certainly from human trafficking. I think there's much more willingness to share red flags, typologies, indicators, and so on. So 100% agree. More collaboration is going to be fundamental.
So I'm interested in all of your observations on how, I know I'm like becoming moderator on the spot, I'm putting you on the spot, but just knowing the challenges that I've, like that idea of collaboration and consortiums and things, especially in the US, how you overcome the privacy regulations and the jurisdictional rules. And it sounds all very lovely, but then it tends to get shut down very quickly when it's like, oh, we can't share that. Like there's conflicting regulations. Yes,
Gary, could she have asked you a better question?
Thank you, Jennifer, for that, and everybody.
This was not planned. I want to be really clear.
There's a U.S. initiative that I'm involved in. We created a brand new company called Consilient, and there's a piece of intellectual property, a technology that I co-invented called Dozer. And for the ABA, we built an explainer video for Dozer. So like if you go to Consilient.com, there's an explainer video of what I'm about to explain. So, and Jennifer, I want to tie 2 points together here, which is your last comment on build versus buy and how financial institutions are hiring data scientists and giving them a sandbox in the basement and saying, go build cool stuff. I love that. And I think that the entire global industry should embrace that. I think whether you build or buy, you need to have a data science team if you can afford one. If you're a large enough institution, have a data science team. If you're a small institution, have a data science team, right? It's, 2 to 5 people, a sandbox, all the software is open source. You should be doing it, and it's a great thing. If you thought I was excited before, what machine learning allows us to do is share algorithms and not data. And that is just a transformative, powerful shift. So the collaboration that most folks think of when they think of these initiatives under 314B of the past have been about sharing data under the safe harbor provided by 314B of the USA Patriot Act in the United States and similar provisions in countries around the world, which is, I'm doing an investigation, I've got a lead, and I want to see if any of my peer banks have information on this same person. So I'm going to share PII under that. And I know Wells Fargo participated in one of those initiatives, as did a lot of the largest US banks. I'm not talking about that. I think that's a great initiative, and I'm totally in favor of it. But what if everybody kept their data at rest, kept their data inside of their own enterprise, inside of their own firewalls, but shared models, shared machine learning models? It's the evolution of what Matt just talked about and Rob talked about, which is like law enforcement sharing a typology. But the way law enforcement shares a typology today is they type it up and they create a PDF and they send it out by email. Like, what if instead of that, what if we just shared the actual model weights and parameters in a machine learning sense? So no privacy implications, no PII, no data, just a thin, lightweight model gets moved around. So there's 2 pieces of technology that I've helped to build. By no means the best technologies in the world, but just as examples. Ghost is reorganizing the internet using transfer learning, meaning everybody that uses Ghost benefits from all the other users of Ghost. The model gets better at re-indexing the internet for counter-human trafficking purposes, but no data ever gets shared. So that's transfer learning, which is a type of federated learning in which there's collaboration while preserving privacy. And then the second is Dozer, which is that Consilient idea, which is there's a Dozer client in law enforcement agency A and bank A and bank B and law enforcement agency B and NGO A, and they all just share the knowledge as if you were writing up a really nice PDF and emailing it to each other, but the knowledge is being shared in a way that actually can be deployed in the data, and it makes it just more efficient. That second initiative is really early stages, so don't let me overstate that. It's not like, you know, there's an easy button and I pushed it and it's done. I'm just saying that that's now possible. We've been talking about it for a decade. 2021, this is now possible. We can do this in 2021. We probably couldn't have done it in 2019. We're just now there. So that's where I think we're going, is collaboration by you having a little data science team in your financial institution and in your NGO. You can participate, because if you think about it, if we're sharing models, I'm going to want you to have a data science team to work on and use that model. And then I want you to allow that model to travel so that other institutions can share it. So now we can have a model or multiple models of human trafficking, human trafficker or human trafficking victim or human trafficking money launderer, and we can have models and we can share those models. And that's where we're going, and I'm obviously very excited about it, and because it improves effectiveness, efficiency, it gives us metrics, and it's privacy preserving. And I think we're there in 2021.
Can I just add 3 very quick points to what Gary said? First off, I think we have to look at, in reflection to what everyone here is saying, is we have to take a look at what is our core group of people that we interact with and network with and colleagues throughout our industry and maybe just outside of our industry in terms of their expertise, their knowledge, and what they're experiencing. And let's start these conversations up again, right? That we all have a new way of doing business because of the pandemic, and, you know, we're all on Zoom every day. Let's do as a group concentrate to say, who can I reach out to? Who can I visit with? Who can I interact with that maybe I haven't spoken to in a while, that may be paying attention to this issue? The second point that I would like to make pertains to the sharing of data, and what data are we really asking to share? I would put out the challenge that a great deal of this data is actually open source, that it's really not privacy protected data. And we think just because it's mixed in or used in cooperation with confidential or controlled data, that we shouldn't share that, which in fact we can. And I know that a lot of people in financial institutions and in their organizations get pushbacks from their legal counsel on this, but really think about to say, if I have this data and I have this knowledge, where did I source it from? If it is open source, then we have to make a decision. What am I willing to communicate, and what are the restrictions about me communicating that? And then my last point, which Gary can probably speak to more than I, is the whole concept of hashing and homomorphic encryption, right? That there are technologies, and Matt is shaking his head, I can see, there are technologies that have been developed by companies, hashing and homomorphic encryption, that are helping to facilitate these relationships and the exchange of information in these private public partnerships. Thank you.
Yeah, so I want to pause there and just, Sam, do we have any questions just even thematically at this point?
We do. I don't know if you're available or if you can see the Q&As. It might be a little easier to go that way, though I'm culling through them. There are a few. Let me see which one I think might be really good for us to look at. There's so many very detailed ones.
Yeah, there are.
Yeah, let's look at this one. Gary, you seem to be our most popular panelist in as far as being named here, sir. This person, Adam, has asked, are there specific areas that those of us in the IC need to be paying specific attention to in countering human trafficking? First, if you would clarify what in the IC means for those who may not know, and then if you'd like to take it from there, please.
So I assume Adam means intelligence community. So if you work in,
probably it.
If you work in, let's just generalize it though for everybody. If you work in a place where you have access to very sensitive data, that could be a bank, it could be law enforcement, it could be a government agency, and you have an intelligence function. Adam's question is, where should you be looking? And if Adam, I got that wrong, you can follow up and correct me, and I'll do better. I believe, building on Rob's last point, I believe that a ton of what you need is open source. Really, we published an academic paper a couple of years ago on human trafficking, and what we did was we looked at the human trafficking is a market, right? I'm an economist, so to me everything's a market, right? But human trafficking is a market, so there's a retail side, right? There's retail, there's logistics, there's finance, right? There's all of the aspects of a business. There has to be a retail side. Retail side is going to be publicly available. You're going to be able to find it on the open web, deep web. You may have to go to the dark web, but you're going to be able to find a lot of data. And in my experience of doing research on this for about a decade, is you can find a lot of information publicly. And the second thing is NGOs. So I think ATII, you've got to make that data available to your analytic process, because there are people that spend a lot of time curating data on perpetrators and victims, and they've got special trust relationships where they have access to data and they protect and anonymize and do all of the appropriate things, but give you ways to build those behavioral models. So if you go back to where I started, 3 kinds of data, right? There's your transaction data inside the bank, or inside your law enforcement agency, you'll have data. Second is your curated data, where I would go to an NGO, I would go to a Dow Jones, I would go to a place that's curating high quality data. And third is make sure you're looking at the big, wide, messy internet, because there's a ton of really valuable data there. And that's how I'd answer that question, Adam.
Rachel, I
Thanks, Gary.
think the one thing I would like to add to that, because both Rob and Gary have mentioned publicly available data, open source data, and what I think is worth thinking about is, in many of the jurisdictions, there's a lot of publicly available data, but there's also certain jurisdictions, and sometimes those are the highest risk jurisdiction, where publicly available is hardly non-existent, right? And then the challenge becomes, how can you actually find the data? Because sometimes governments will go to great lengths to hide the data that should be publicly available, or that is publicly available in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to maybe add to that. I'm picking up on what Robert said, and Gary as well, actually, with regards to the blend of data, open, curated, internal, external, is that I was fortunate enough to sit alongside one of our clients as they walked through a couple of different examples of investigations using this blended approach. And initially it started off with something in the news, a conviction in the news, a TV program that came out on one of the channels that just triggered something within one of the special investigations teams to then bring that back to work the following day and proactively start investigating. And then from there, from this purely open source news documentary, they were able to find and start to piece together a network and build out this network from scratch that then started to interact with some transactional data, then led to some interesting shared counterparties that could then be explored through curated data. And this network started to, piece by piece, really build out to a phenomenally complex data set, a network that really just started with this one thing that hadn't yet made a curated set, it hadn't yet done anything. But then when you build it out, all of those data sources came together, and the result was quite spectacular to see.
So that's actually, thanks, Matt. That's a great segue to where I want to go next. And Ingrid, I'm going to ask you to talk, especially as we look at the spectrum of blending open source with what's inside an institution with, to your point, proprietary data that maybe has to be captured. I know some places you actually have to have brick and mortar in the country to actually get access to information. So as we look at the beneficial ownership problem, and not just from a regulatory standpoint here in the US, but just from the standpoint of how it can help you find these bad actors, what sort of missteps have you seen over the course of your career that maybe you could share with the folks folks attending today that they could, easily avoid just based on your realm of experience? And then I know we have a lot of different views on this, so I'll probably next go back to Matt, and then Jennifer, I'd love to hear maybe, where you're able to talk about some of the experiences you've seen inside banking on this.
I think that the biggest misstep, if that's what you want to call, I think is goes back to what I was just saying, right? And it is genuinely the lack of information, or the lack of the availability of incorrect information. And there's lots of different examples. So unless you have an official register that is actually being kept up to date, because two different things, right? Because sometimes there's an official register, but you have no obligation to keep it up to date. But unless you have that, you have to piece it together based on disclosures, filings, but anything that a country jurisdiction requires you to document. We've seen examples in jurisdictions where they have information available in the native language and in English, and the information never matches, right? So if you don't know that and you use the English version, then ultimately your beneficial ownership information is incorrect. We've seen instances where the information simply disappears because it becomes too risky, and suddenly everybody is looking at that same type of information and the register goes offline. So depending on if you have to compile it by using publicly information, it's really important understanding the quality of the source that you are using, and the freshness of the data, right? Because if the data is 5 years old, the source might be really good, but it's no longer relevant in most instances.
Sure. So Matt, do you want to add on to that?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, no, I suppose in terms of some of the missteps that I've seen and some of the evolution, some of the missteps I've seen have been down to just the manually intensive process of trying to map out complex structures from brochures, from documents, from open source materials. It's historically challenging. And to Ingrid's point, because I've had to do this manually, when you're trying to take a review or an investigation into something that is in a language outside of your understanding, it becomes increasingly complex. So I think that's not so much missteps, but just challenges. Now, certainly in terms of an increase in available curated data that has this available is phenomenally transformational. So having systems similar to what Quantexa can do, which is automatically map out that connectivity and that parent-child hierarchy structure, and be able to use all of that data to really understand who's owning what. And ultimately, when you follow that thread through that connectivity, find that ultimate beneficial owner and then everything around them. So, that's that ability to supplement what you still have to do as a human, but have the ability to utilize curated data, massively, massively transformational.
And Jennifer, what have you seen in the banking space around? Is there, are people worried about this? Is it something they feel like it's going to be good?
Well, I'm going to give my personal opinion.
That's fair.
Instead of based on observations from working with many banks and bankers. But I think that hands down, the data just doesn't exist, and criminals will avoid reporting requirements at all costs. So it turns into this exercise of frustration, and it's all for naught. And I know everybody wants to do the right thing, and I was actually shocked that we in the United States passed this AML Act that has this requirement in there, because it is transformative. And if we can execute it and not have too many exemptions and if we can make it work, it will go a long way, especially in creating efficiencies and processes. It'll make that process easier. But challenges that I've seen is just lack of availability of the data and efforts to do things that aren't actually identifying the real risk of a customer. In past positions I've had at other places, it's let's take a step back of these requirements, right? We think FinCEN CDD rule, for example, that's not going to identify the real risk of a customer or their owners, but what other things can we look at? If we're going to try to do the right thing, let's look at other things. Let's look at criminal histories, let's look at things, but that adds on time and expense, and then you're looking at false positives, and then that's when you enter machine learning and algorithms. So it kind of brings it all full circle of, is it effective? Is it going to be great? Maybe, maybe not, probably not. However, step back and look at how to identify the real risk of a customer.
Sure. Matt, did you have something you wanted to add, or Gary?
I'll add one real quick thing, and then if I may, just maybe from a European experience, for those that have not, who want to maybe understand what some of the implications of when when you rely on sort of those common registries, country by country in the EU, we have to have these registries. Now, based where I am here in Luxembourg, there was quite a, for those that are interested in maybe understanding a little bit more around some of the scandals surrounding these as a topic, we had something in the last few weeks called Open Looks, where a number of journalists managed to get access and then publish a list of declared beneficial owners within the country, which highlighted a whole series of challenges. So I think, there's a lot of challenges, both in terms of capturing, maintaining and understanding the risks around your UBOs in places like Luxembourg and others. And I think as we get some of the transparency around the importance of understanding UBOs, I think that's really going to drive. Again, I don't want to keep saying the word transformational, but I feel we are in that period where we have an opportunity to be really transformational. And so, I just wanted to raise that one.
Gary, you go, and then I've got.
Thanks. I still want to respond to your last comment, Jennifer, so I got to catch up to you. There's three kinds of data. There's the internal data, there's the curated external, and then there's the big messy external. So, and there's, so those, I've already established, or at least argued for those, that way to dissect the world of data. And then I want to add one other dimension, which would be investigations, which is what everybody's been talking about, and discovery. So I'm interested in that sort of way off quadrant, which is discovery, not before the investigation. Like, how do you know who to investigate? And then looking at more data and the pre-curated data, the still messy data. And that's the paradigm shift. That's that cultural shift that everybody's talking about, that is wrapped up in the US AML reform bill that just passed, which is this idea that we have to have risk-based systems, right? The standard shifted with the AML reform bill of 2020. It's not how much data are you sending to FinCEN or to your regulator, it's do you have a risk-based system? And we can measure that. So I think we need to think about discovery of risk and not just how we handle the leads that we have. When I worked on this MEMEX program about 10 years ago that I mentioned to you all before, right, we were looking for human trafficking. And as Jennifer said, the information on human trafficking didn't exist. It wasn't on the curated lists. It wasn't easily reachable via Google. It wasn't in the arrest records databases, right? Because the criminals plead to lesser and different crimes. It's like the data didn't exist. So we said, well, let's go out into the big, messy, unstructured internet world and see if we can build our own index. Let's see if we can build an index of the internet for counter-human trafficking. And that's when we discovered a lot of data, and we built models, and we found signal and noise, and we made tremendous progress. So it wasn't about working a case, and it wasn't about looking at curated data externally or looking at the internal data. Or let me just restate that. It wasn't about only looking at the curated data and only looking at the internal data. You need both of those. But you need to take a step back and be open to discovery what you don't know, and then use the machine learning to minimize those false positives, increase your true positives, so that way you're not kind of killing the workforce with a lot of busy work that just causes them to quit and feel like they're not making a difference in the world. So external data is both the curated and uncurated. So you have to go into the messy internet space, and you know, we've been doing this for a decade now, and it's amazing what you learn that surprises you when you do that, if you can do it in a way that's efficient, so no false positives. And think about discovery, which is left of investigation, because I think that's where we're going to find the human traffickers and the money launderers for the human traffickers, because they're getting away with it today, and they got away with it yesterday and the day before. And we got to take a step back and say, what have we been doing wrong, and how can machine learning help us open the aperture, look wider and broader, and do so in an efficient way to increase our effectiveness.
Rachel, I have a comment about what Gary had to say, but I think Jennifer wanted to build on maybe the topic she brought up or the question before I offer some comment.
Well, you go ahead, so that way I don't
Okay.
side rail.
Yeah. In terms of what Gary just said, we already have some pretty efficient processes or operations in place in some of the other programs and requirements that we have in financial institutions. And so that overlap in terms of what we're trying to do with human trafficking. So I'll bring up, for example, our sanctions watch list management section, checking, that there are some processes that we're involved with that could really help if we take some of the analytics and some of the human assets that we use for checking sanctions, and say, how can we broaden that view to see if any of the players that might be on the sanctions list or the checking that we do can actually be micro-focused on human trafficking. So as an example, and we're going to get into, this comment is about some of the other countries in the world that Ingrid was talking about, where I'm going to talk about PEPs. So we know that politically exposed people are usually the conglomerate of the elites that control many aspects of companies. So just think about how valuable it could be if we took, somehow meshed this great PEP list type of processing that we're doing and saying, is there a possibility that some of these PEPs or the people attached to the PEPs or the companies or entities, beneficial ownership that these PEPs are involved with, both on a domestic and an international basis, are they also involved in human trafficking? This also another aspect of sanctions that we have to understand, that it is very difficult to track, is all the counterparty activity that takes place in sanctions. Who is our sanctioned individual actually doing business with? What are the layering that's taking place to avoid tracking and observation and saying, yes, this is the person that's involved, and it tracks back to the original sanctioned individual or entity. So we're already doing some of this work. I think everyone knows all of the advanced analytics that we use for sanctions checking, and this is a place, a technology that I think we should celebrate our successes and some of our effectiveness. I'm not saying there aren't a large amount of false positives in sanction checking. We all know that. But this is an area that Gary kind of hinted at when he talked about pulling in this data. We're already dealing with the different types of data that come into sanctions management. Let's celebrate that, and let's say, how can we use that in terms of this fight of human trafficking?
Jennifer, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, well, I kind of have like a different, I completely agree, but it got me thinking about what we talked about before, how human trafficking, there's a lot of awareness around it, and we see it more and more. I was at the dentist the other day, and there was a sign in the bathroom in my little dentist office, and I told them to get that in multiple languages when I was there. But there's a lot of awareness around human trafficking. And if I talk, this is to all the attendees, because I think a lot of people probably don't even know what you do. You probably talk to your neighbors and they're like, what do you do? And you're like, I'm not even going to try to explain it to you. So I think it's important when we talk to our neighbors, if you said, what are your thoughts on human trafficking? Everybody says it's horrible, right? We get it. So what is something we can do as individuals, as owners of small businesses, large businesses, employees, corporations, as a society? What can we do to stop it? And one thing I don't think people make the connection to, my neighbors certainly don't until I talk their ear off about it, is corporate transparency and how important corporate transparency is, and explaining what that is to regular people that don't work in this industry. So that way, when we're voting, when we're looking at things like this, we can really push for effective corporate transparency at the regulation level and like execute it in a meaningful way that trickles down into the banking industry. It's something I think that people want to know about, but don't really understand. They're like, what does corporate transparency have to do with anything? And so we are responsible, us and all the attendees on this call are responsible for sharing that message of the details of not just human trafficking is bad and we don't want it to happen, but how. And that's a huge part of it.
And I think that's a
Go ahead.
Oh, Rachel. No, I was going to say, I'm glad that you bring that up, Jennifer, because I can't count the times that I have to try to explain what I do, and I'm not being very successful, right? And especially with children, and the only time that I was successful was when I started talking about human trafficking, and then suddenly I got invited to the schools and I could talk about it. And I think that is ultimately how you spread the word, but I also believe I could do a much better job and always use that as a starting point almost, as opposed to starting about data and risk and compliance and AML, because by that point, half of the people have disconnected.
I think that's an excellent point. So I want to be thoughtful about our time. We have about 13 minutes left. Rob, I have a specific question for you I'm going to ask. And once that's done, I would like for each panelist to give me some closing thoughts. So since I'm going to put you on the spot, Rob, I will let you go last when it comes to your closing thoughts. I do want to echo the sentiment, though, of education is huge in helping people understand how all the pieces of the puzzle work, so that we can get that or increase and keep the groundswell that's currently that we currently have. So Rob, the question that's specific is, how does law enforcement, I'm actually going to paraphrase the question. I used to sit in the branch, so that meant I had to wait for Raleigh Police Department to come to me with a subpoena to say, hey, I need this information. And I had to send it through 18 different places to get said information that's transactional in nature. I also know that over time, I grew relationships with law enforcement so I could have more informal, or what I like to call Chatham House rules conversations, where if you ask me questions, I will do my best to give you the information you need without me violating the BSA Act and without you giving me too much information. So thinking about the fact that transactions are personally identifiable information, oftentimes, what have you seen that's worked in the past from that type of information in collaborating with law enforcement, so that I'm not 3 weeks later, I've got your subpoena cleared by my internal counsel, but your bad actor's now moved to either a different jurisdiction or is now completely gone?
Well, that's a great question, especially I'm assuming this is coming from someone at a financial institution. So whatever they do, they always have to be cognizant of the idea that they can't and should not violate any of their privacy or bank regulations for communicating not only with law enforcement, but with other people. That being said, I think that what should be emphasized is the core of this question. It's all about relationships. That the first time that people are communicating or asking for information or looking to share information shouldn't be when an incident or an act has occurred. This platform should already be built. These outreaches into the community and the liaison between companies, financial institutions, and law enforcement, these relationships should be in place on a colleague level and on a personal level. And I think, speaking, and you brought up Raleigh, North Carolina, for example, in Raleigh, I know that the Secret Service has regional types of meetings with representatives from risk, fraud, and compliance, in the Raleigh area where everyone sits down and shares information. And what this creates, and no one is looking to have information shared that they shouldn't have, but this sets up what I call the back channel of information, the unofficial information that takes place where professionals exchange and get to know each other. And it could be something so simple as that someone in the brick and mortar front lines of a bank tells the person in the FIU or in the other parts of the bank, hey, I observed this or I found this. I don't know where the heck to take it, right? But while the person in the FIU, the investigative function, they have the relationship. And so, you know, all these little pieces of the hay in the haystack mean nothing, and they're useless until they can be blended together, either by law enforcement or from other colleagues in the financial institution. I don't know whether I totally answered the question, but it's kind of that it's a difficult place to be because you have to maintain the standards of the rules that you have to operate in, either in law enforcement or in your financial institution. And that's where the importance of, you know, the 314 exchange and the filing of SARs and the subpoenas are very important. And, you know, even the interaction that can take place between the financial institution's lawyer and someone from the district attorney's office or the U.S. attorney's office, sometimes that can really, really accelerate the interaction that goes on in the exchange of information. I hope that answer has helped.
I think so. Yeah, thank you for weighing in. So I think, you know, some of the big themes we've heard as we come to a close today, I remember hearing Marcus Schultz, formerly of Standard Chart, talk about bad actors and risk, and mitigating risk is like trying to cut off the water flow. You know, bad actors will always find the path of least resistance. So I don't think any of us want to assume that there's a silver bullet here that's going to solve this problem of stopping human trafficking. It's about the economics inside the bank. It's about the economics for a vendor. It's about educating the people just in our small microcosms. So with that, we have about 8 minutes, which gives each of you about 90 seconds to give me some closing remarks. And I will start with you, Jennifer.
All right. So closing remarks is more of recommendations of like, what do you do now that you've listened to this panel? We've talked about a lot of things. What the heck is machine learning? And I know that if there are 1,700 plus people on this call, there are a lot of people who have no idea what machine learning is, other than generically. There are a lot of resources out there, so I would encourage people to really go even just read about it and understand the difference between a behavioral-based machine learning algorithm and why and how it performs so much differently and better than rules-based, because outwardly they can look very similar. Look into supervised versus unsupervised machine learning and where and how those can both fit into your programs and your risk programs, because there are cases where supervised is best, and then unsupervised where you can uncover hidden risks and all kinds of things, and be more creative. So that would be my recommendation. I love this idea of sharing algorithms and not data. And there is also, I don't know where I'm at in my 90 seconds, but one thing we didn't really talk about is simple automation techniques. There is other technology. You don't have to like overthrow everything for these complex new ideas that really aren't that new, just new to our compliance space. But things like robotic process automation, leveraging your APIs, scheduling batch files, simple stuff that can help you automate your manual tasks. But if you're not taking advantage of those, you can at least gain operational efficiencies that way.
Sure. So Ingrid, I'll come to you.
I think I wanted to end with a silver lining, because just as you, Rachel, I like silver linings. We commissioned a piece of research to Edelman Data and Intelligence, and the purpose of the research was to look at human trafficking pre-pandemic and then actually compare it to what happened in the pandemic. And the research focuses on the first 6 months. So it compares January to June 2019 to 2020. And the not silver lining is that the coverage in media decreases during the pandemic for very obvious reasons. But what was interesting to see is that actually, when you look at social, so move away from traditional media, you can actually see that there is a consistent voice that continues to fight for the who continues to fight against human trafficking. And what my positive takeaway from that research was that actually that consistent voice is only growing, and that is what ultimately is going to be a positive factor in this.
That is indeed heartwarming. Matt, I'll come to you.
Okay, thanks for that. I just want to take a few seconds to say thank you as well to the organization and to the panelists. I've really enjoyed the engagement, the questions, and the preparation. So I think it's been really empowering and positive. In terms of my sort of closing comments, I want to take it right the way back to maybe where I started. So we've talked a lot about machine learning, sharing of algorithms, smart ways of detection, and so on, different data that's available. I want to sort of tie it back right to where I started, that the ability to bring all of this data together in a really meaningful way, to be able to then power those models and analytics and detection mechanics, entity resolution, and being able to bring this together, absolutely foundational. It will really help bring that data together that will provide the networks that will feed all of the different models. So whether you're looking for those shared addresses, looking to be able to follow the funds, looking for the consolidated view, I really want to sort of encourage all of the attendees to really just look into that as a topic and how it can play in this domain, because it's a really powerful force. So again, I want to finish by thanking you all, and well, Moyen from Luxembourg.
And you, Gary.
Thanks, Rachel, for an awesome job leading the discussion, and to the fellow panelists. I've really enjoyed getting to know you all over the last month or so. I'm here because I just think ATII is doing amazing and important work, and I just wanted to join in the following Money to Fight Slavery Summit. I had to look at my notes to make sure I got it right. Because this is really important work, and I hope that we've contributed to ATII and to the movement. There's nothing more meaningful, I believe. If you think about missions that you could be dedicating hours of your life to, I don't know what is more important than this one. And I truly believe that. I'm here and available to support anybody who's engaging in this fight and in this mission, and hopefully I'm making a little bit of a contribution. So thanks for the opportunity to participate and endorse this organization and this movement. One thing to remember, I guess, from the things I've talked about is discovery. Think about ways to take advantage of more data and the technology that's available today to identify unknown risks. And that would be my call to action to everybody, is think about discovery of yet unknown risks, and doing it in a way that's efficient and effective. And that would be my call to action at the end here. And again, thanks everybody for the opportunity.
And Rob, if you could give us some final thoughts.
What's really important here is, as Gary pointed out, is follow the money. But I would say, let's end with this: follow your passion and what you could be passionate about. If this is one area that you are passionate about, go for it, and understand that some of the more traditionalists within your financial institution, they are not going to see this area as a priority, because they don't see some of the risk attached to it, right? The reputation risk is huge, because if your institution gets identified as having some of this commerce run through it, you're going to be on the front page of the New York Times or the London Times, right? But so you are going to get some pushback with this, but be passionate about it, and also bring that passion to the technology teams that support your functions within your financial institution. Let them know that this should not be on the bottom of their whiteboard with a magic marker, that they should move it to the top. And I think this panel today has been offered very great expertise, how this is not a siloed issue, that this type of behavior flows throughout many different components of the company or the financial institution, and that this is an opportunity for us to really, really do great things together. Let me just say, as other people have said, I appreciate everything that Aaron and everybody else at ATII has done, appreciate this panel, but really, really give thanks to all the people that have stayed with us for over an hour now, listening to us of our insights. And what you do on the front lines is the important prioritized work. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I would close by saying again, echoing what everyone on the panel has said, this has been an absolute privilege to moderate today. To be surrounded by such forward thinking and passion is just very heartwarming. We'll give a virtual round of applause for our panelists, and certainly thank you to all of you who joined us live. And again, for your 90 minutes, I'm 1 minute over, so my Navy dad would not be happy, but I hope you all are be safe and be well in the coming months and weeks. Thanks, Sam.
Fantastic. You guys were amazing. My heart is so full. Thank you for being here. We'll be finalizing the recording and send everything out to all of our participants, those who were here live, as well as those who weren't able.